Welcome to the online ministry of Pidcoke United Methodist Church. Pidcoke UMC is located on FM 116 about halfway between Gatesville and Coppers Cove. We have a 10 o'clock service in our sanctuary on Sunday mornings with a small congregation in attendance. So if you're desirous of a place where you can meet with a small group of people in an intimate worship setting, consider coming to be with us, joining us for our worship at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, Pidcoke United Methodist Church, halfway between Gatesville and Coppers Cove. Now this morning, I want to call your attention back to the book of Isaiah, the 6th chapter, the second part in a series that we're going through looking at revival. What are the distinctives of revival? Well, let's read what the Bible has to say. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, and his train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. As we began this series last week, talking about the fact that the need that we have in the church today, the need that we have in our country, the need that we have in our world, is not the need for reforms. Political reforms will do nothing to change the hearts of people. Political reforms and even social reforms will have nothing to do with the bigotry and the prejudices that live in the hearts of men and women, regardless of what ethnicity or race they may happen to be. Reforms will not change the hearts and minds of men. It's that simple. Only revival can do that. Revival being, as R.A. Torrey called it, a time when God visits his people and imparts to them new life, and then they in turn impart new life to others who are dead in trespasses and sins. Revival is a time when God transforms his people. As United Methodists, we take as our mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The idea of the transformation of the world is not to reform society. Certainly we would like to see things better. We'd like to see people treat people better. We would like to see people respect each other. We'd like to see people treated equally. And yet, the transformation of the world doesn't come about through reform. The transformation of the world comes about by the transformation of the hearts and minds of men and women and boys and girls through the gospel of Jesus Christ. As we look at the example of Isaiah, this vision that Isaiah had, the experience that he went through, we see here at least 3 distinctives of that revival. We talked about the first last week, which is a heightened awareness of the presence and the person of God. This thing of seeing God as God is, not seeing God as somehow or the other we envision God to be, not seeing God as somehow or the other something that our society says God should be, or that our church says God should be, or that our culture says God should be, but as God is. Isaiah saw him seated upon a throne, high, lifted up, and the train of his robe, he said, filled the temple. Speaking to God's glory and majesty. The seraphim flying about through that temple, crying out, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. Speaking to the holiness, the reverence, the awesomeness of God. Not good English, but I think you know what I mean. Isaiah saw that vision of God. So that's the first distinctive in revival, seeing God as God is, coming close to the presence and the person of God. So what's the second distinctive? Well, I believe the second distinctive stems from that first. In fact, without that first distinctive, there can be no revival. because revival is something that happens in the hearts and minds of men because they've been in the presence of God. Isaiah looked and he beheld. And as he beheld, he was stricken, awe-stricken by what he saw. Human language is too puny a thing. It's too puny a tool to describe the grandeur of what Isaiah saw. Like John on the Isle of Patmos. John saw the vision of the Lord standing among the 7 candlesticks, among the 7 lampstands. And he fell at his feet, he said, as one who was dead, awe-stricken by what he saw. His heart, his whole being engulfed in the grandeur and the power and the majesty of what he saw. And John, as we read, fell at his feet as one who was dead. Now we'd think that someone who would see a vision like that would be just, oh, they'd be glad and they'd be dancing and they'd be happy. And yet, like Job protested through 40 chapters of his book about how he thought God was being unjust to him, about how he was perfect in his ways and God was not treating him properly. And then when God finally answered Job, not answering him in the sense of telling Job, this is why you're going through this, but God saying, Job, you've taken a lot on yourself here. You've raised yourself up as a standard by which the world should be judged. You've raised yourself up as a standard by which I should be judged. And certainly we do that in our churches today. We say God is a bully because God brings judgment. And yet, we're not God. We don't see what God sees. Our perspective is so small and so narrow that we don't see God as God is. Job, when God answered him out of the whirlwind, Job had a strong change come over him. Job said this. He said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. He said, I have heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. John, Job, Isaiah saw God, saw a vision of God. They couldn't see God in God's entirety. No one can do that. And yet, what they did see, that glimpse that they had, brought them to a place of abject humility. Now we read Isaiah's response, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. But notice why he said that. For my eye has seen the King, the Lord of hosts. What we see here is not self-loathing. Many times we're taught we should loathe ourselves. We should see ourselves as somehow unfit and unclean, and certainly we are compared to God. And yet what we see here and what's enjoined on us here is not self-loathing. It's humility. I've heard it said that in order to be saved, a person must first realize 2 things. First, there is a God. And second, you're not Him. Think about that for just a second. There is a God, and I'm not God. God is God. And when I come fresh into the presence of God, when I see God as God is, what happens is I see reflected back to me my own unworthiness, my own lack of strength, my own lack of wisdom, my own lack of judgment. And it brings me to that place of humility where I realize that God has shown me His wonder, His might, His majesty. Who am I? One of the prophets would say, who am I that you should speak to me? That you should reach out to me, that you should use me, that you should put words in my mouth. Who am I? What am I? As the prophet said humbly, I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. I mean, think about it. Listen to the television, the radio, whatever it is, whatever media it is you happen to consume on a daily basis, and listen to what comes out of the hearts and minds and mouths of people. It's unclean. It's profane. It's obscene. It doesn't carry with it the wisdom or the understanding of God. It doesn't bring people to the understanding of who God is and what God expects of us, what God has for us. No. We're undone, as the King James says, Isaiah said, because our lips are unclean. And we live among people who are just like us. You see, Isaiah was a preacher of righteousness. Isaiah would stand and preach against the wickedness and the evils of his day. Woe to them who put good for evil, light for dark, dark for light, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. Woe to them. Isaiah was a preacher of woe. And now, having seen God, having seen his own image reflected back to him off the brilliance of who God is, Isaiah realizes he's no different than the people around him. One of the most humbling things that I've faced over the years as a preacher, and it's something that comes to me over and over again because I'm human, I forget, is that I'm no different than the people I'm preaching to. There's not a particle bit of difference between me and the worst killer on death row in Huntsville. You and I are all unworthy. You and I are all unclean in the face of the majesty, the perfection, the holiness, the splendor and majesty of God. So when we see God, when we see that vision of God, when we're drawn close to God again, when we see God as God is, what happens to us is we're humbled. We're brought low. Again, not to the place of self-loathing. That's not what God is after. God does not want us to loathe ourselves. He wants us to worship Him. Because when we worship God, when we see God as God is, when we reach out and see that spectacle, see that might, see that power, see that glory, what we are fades away into nothingness. And all that matters is the God that we see. All that matters is the beauty of His person. All that matters is the majesty of that one who is the master, the creator, the ruler of all the universe. A universe that's infinite and still growing. A universe that we've been trying for thousands of years to try to fathom the depths of what is the universe. How does it exist? What holds it together? And then we're brought back to the realization that God holds it together. Oh, perhaps not in the simplistic ways that our ancient forefathers viewed it, but we have to realize that what we see about us, this universe that we see about us, this world that we see about us, is too complex, too magnificent to just have happened. It didn't create itself. Nothing creates itself. That defies the laws of logic. God has created. God sustains. God holds together. Does that humble you to realize that we serve a God who commands all and is all? Humbling. Humility. Bringing us to that place where we realize that we're not the center of the universe. You've seen them. I have too. Children, young people, adults who think that they're the center of the universe, that the whole world revolves around them, that they are the most important personage in all of creation, that no one else really matters except them. They demand blind obedience so that whoever looks to them says whatever he wants or she wants, that's what we will give them because they are supreme. We've seen rulers do that over the years. Emperors, dictators, presidents in some cases, in some countries. We've seen that kind of pattern of behavior. None of them realizing that they're not the center of the universe. They're not the master of all that they survey. God is. I have never known of a case where a person has seen a vision of God. Perhaps not in the sense that Isaiah did, or John did, or Job did, but where they've come face to face with the realization of the presence of God, been touched by that presence, that they haven't been brought to that place where they humbly acknowledge that God is God. They're not God. God is. They don't possess all the wisdom in the world. God does. They can't say, God, you don't know what you're doing, because they don't know what God is doing. They can't say, God, you're not just. You're not fair. I've heard that a few times, haven't you? Maybe even said it. I have. Without realizing that God is the very embodiment of justice. They can't cry out, at least not rightfully and truthfully cry out like a small child, you just don't love me, when God has given them all the love there is to give, because God is love. Seeing that vision of God, seeing God as God is, brings a person to that place where they realize how small and insignificant they are, and how wondrously magnificent God is. I remember seeing a series of photographs that was taken when the volcano, Mount St. Helens, out in Washington State erupted back in 1980. In the foreground of those pictures is a hiker standing on the edge of a rock, many miles away from the volcano at a safe distance. In the first frame, he's just standing there watching that smoking, heaving mountain. And in the next frame, the mountain has exploded, and the hiker has fallen down, been knocked off his feet, just sitting there in wonder at the power of what he's seen. Imagine seeing God. Imagine realizing who God is and what God is. Imagine seeing the power, recognizing the power of God, recognizing the justice of God, the justness of God, and the love of God. What would that do to you? What should it do to me? It should bring us to humility, humbly coming before God to praise and worship Him. You see, the second distinctive of revival is a deepened sense of sin that results in a humbling of the heart. Isaiah said, I'm lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell among people of unclean lips. I've seen God, and I don't deserve to see God. That humility that came to him because of what he had seen. Now the question for us today, for those of us who are part of a church, the question for us today is, what are we seeing? What are we looking for? Are we looking for an organization to preserve our way of life? Are we looking for an organization to reform society so that it operates the way that we think it should? No matter which end of the political spectrum we happen to be at. Are we looking for an institution that makes us feel good through its rituals, through its traditions, through its practices? Or are we looking for a fellowship among people honestly seeking the presence of God? I've heard of, you have too, those that say, oh, when I saw the Lord. And they talk about how they were on a first name basis with the Almighty. They talk about how grandly and boldly they spoke to the Almighty. That doesn't happen. I don't know of a single example in Scripture where that happened. The only one who's ever been able to speak to God as a peer is that one who himself is God, Jesus Christ. I used to, years ago, I would go through an annual performance audit, performance review. And that scale, there was a scale that was used back in the day that was a 7-point scale. 1 being, you're probably on your way out the door. And 7 being, as an old boss of mine used to say, you'll get a 7 the day that you walk across the lake to get to the office. In other words, when you're as perfect as Jesus Christ, then you'll get a 7. I don't know anyone who deserves a 7. When you see God, the result is humility. The second distinctive of revival is when we humble ourselves before God. James says, humble yourself before the Lord, and He will lift you up. We seek experiences, we seek power, we seek status and prestige, we seek all of these things to lift ourselves up. And yet, God says, humble yourself. Get over yourself, in other words. Humble yourself before God and let God lift you up. The 2 distinctives of revival we've seen so far. The first is a heightened awareness of the presence and the person of God. The second is a deep awareness of our own sinfulness and unworthiness that produces in us a righteous humility that seeks only to know God and to be right before God. Next week we're going to look at the third distinctive. We'll talk about that when we get to that next week. But right now I want to share with you just a couple of things. First of all, June 27th will be my last Sunday as the pastor at Pitcoke United Methodist Church. After much prayer and careful consideration, we've decided, my wife and I have decided, it's time for me to finally fully retire. This will be the 3rd time. Maybe it'll stick this time. Pastor Bill Jones will be taking over the 1st of July as the pastor. At this point, I don't know whether Pastor Bill is going to try to continue these videos or not, or whether he's going to try to continue the daily devotionals that I've been sending out for the last 16 months or so. But regardless, you'll be looking at a new face when you come to Pitcoke United Methodist Church. I want to thank you for in advance, for your encouragement and support as you've watched these videos, for your just for the feedback you've given me that's helped me to understand your needs and how to better minister to those needs. And I want to encourage you, continue to seek after God. We've seen 2 ways to seek God as God is, to have a deepened awareness of His presence and of His person. And secondly, having seen that presence in that person, having experienced that closeness to God, to embrace the humility that comes with that. Revival comes after that. We'll talk about that next week. I want to thank you for listening this morning, and may God bless you.